Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our third session of Post-Truth in the Musical Humanities. Today, Wolfgang Marx and I, Alexandra Monchick, would like to welcome Philip Ewell, who I'm sure you all know, for a dialogue on polarization in music theory. And this is being recorded. We have started a website, Post-Truth in the Musical Humanities, on YouTube, where all of these will be recorded. We also, procedural-wise, ask you to go to the Q&A rather than the chat, if possible, for asking questions, because it provides some amount of anonymity, and it feels safer in such a, hopefully not contentious, but lively dialogue. So thank you all for coming. And let me introduce Philip Ewell and Wolfgang.
Thank you very much. And I'm also very grateful to Philip Ewell for joining us this evening, or this evening where I am. And we are talking about the fallout from his work. I talked a little bit about that 2 weeks ago in my own paper, and I'm sure most of you are very well aware of this. The whole process started with the keynote he gave in November 2019 at the annual meeting of the Society for Music Theory, which then led to a more detailed version published as an article, Music Theory and the White Racial Frame in Music Theory Online. And that triggered a wide range of responses, pro and con, among other things, an issue of the Journal of Shankarian Studies, which was also then controversially discussed. Now, today, just like last week, we don't want to talk that much about the content, although maybe we also have a few questions about that, but more about the way in which people engage with each other in the context of this type of scholarship. So the way we're going to do this is we are going to invite Philip to talk to us for a few minutes about his own impressions about how this all unfolded. We'll have a bit of a discussion between us and Philip on the panel here, and then we open it up to the floor, and you are invited to already type questions as we go along, or then type them when we open it to the floor. Both are fine, and then we try to answer as many of them as possible. So, Philip, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you, Ali. Great to be with you in Ireland. I'm here in New York. And I'm going to, I have 2 slides and I will share my screen in just a minute, but if I can just give a couple of comments before I do that, I should take 6 or 7 minutes, I think, before we get to our discussion. So I've given many talks over the last roughly 13 months. And many of those talks, almost all of them, have focused in one way or another on diversity, equity, and inclusivity, and also on anti-racism and anti-sexism. Those are things that I quite distinguish in my mind. DEI on the one hand, and anti-racism, anti-sexism on the other. We can talk about that if you want in the discussion. But one thing I've noticed on the many, many Zoom galleries that I've looked at on my computer screens is what I call a lot of deer in the headlights among white friends and colleagues in different music institutions, usually in the United States, but as far afield also as South Africa and Brazil and Ireland and England and Germany as well, and certainly Canada. And I like to address that kind of head on. I've always addressed that in my writings, but I have 3 points that I like to make because of that. I think because there is this kind of confusion, things are moving very fast in how we are reimagining music curricula in the United States. By the way, I will often be speaking about American Music Academy or in the United States. So I don't want to speak about what's happening in Ireland specifically. Of course, Ali's faculty in California, but I do focus it on the United States of America, and I know that many people can make connections with wherever they are, Ireland or elsewhere. So I do often make these points to try to invite people into conversations properly, especially white colleagues, because I do feel that there have been lots of deer in headlights. So I make these 3 points, which I'm going to share on a slide now, and then I'm going to contextualize it with one other funny vignette, let's say, and then we can have our discussion. So let me share my screen and make sure that I have audio in there. Yep, that's there. Okay, there's that. And I trust that you are seeing this now. Okay, so 3 important points that I've always made, but here they are on the slide. It's important. I never have, or I don't seek to cast aspersions or assign blame. Some people try to tell me I am. I'm not. I never have. That is wrong. I don't think anybody should feel guilt or feel blame. No white person should be thinking that they should be taking blame, and I'm certainly not pointing the finger. The only person I might point the finger at is Philip Ewell, because I certainly have been, my work over the past decades has served to fortify the whiteness and the maleness of American music theory without question. So I don't talk, and race scholars generally don't talk about assigning blame or guilt. What we all talk about as race scholars is 2 things: responsibility and accountability. Do white people bear some responsibility to look clear-eyed at the past, at our racial past, to right wrongs? Yes, absolutely. But I'm a Black guy, and guess what? I too bear some responsibility, and I want to bear that responsibility. It just means having adult conversations about race. That's really all it means. And I want to hold myself accountable. And I think we should all want to hold ourselves accountable. Yes, white persons absolutely should hold themselves accountable. And that just means being better. There's nothing wrong with being better, and not with denying the past, because the past has helped shape the future. Has helped to shape the future everywhere, here in America, certainly in Ireland as well. So I often speak, and race scholars often speak, of responsibility and accountability. Secondly, I view white persons to be extremely important to the process of reimagining our American music curricula. So this is happening really at every institution, musical institution in the United States of America. I know that it's happening elsewhere. I will try to speak only about the United States today. And white persons are very welcome at my table of reimagining what we do in the academic study of music in the United States. I just want to be very clear and explicit. Caveats: if there is a person who is white, Black, or of any other race or of any other identity who thinks, for example, that Black people need to be raised up to a certain standard because they are now substandard, that person is not welcome at my table. If there's a person who believes, for example, that cisgender men are more capable of conducting orchestras, not welcome at my table. I will not debate the humanity of non-white races. I will not debate the humanity of non-cisgender men. That is not open for debate. So I do not want those people at my table. They are going to waste time. They are not arguing in good faith. Otherwise, everyone, irrespective of race, irrespective of gender, irrespective of any other identity, is most welcome at my table. Let's get to work together. Third, I believe that everyone will benefit from this reimagining, including white persons themselves. This is maybe the most important point. It's something that race scholars have been saying really for centuries. I'm a newbie at this. I've been doing race scholarship for just 5 or 6 years, I would say. But really, going back many, many decades, I think centuries. Race scholars often talk about how white persons are also collateral damage in a white supremacist system. They are suffering too. It is not really in question. If you make it a zero-sum game, which is what a white supremacist patriarchy will always do. If I say Beethoven was an above average composer, a response will be no, he's the best composer in the world has ever seen, or he was at the bottom. There's no middle ground, right? It's zero sum. The reason why zero-summedness is so common among white supremacist systems is because it is a very effective tool in order to keep white people in power at the very top of the system. In fact, many of the things that of the policies and laws and legislation that white supremacist historically systems have enacted very much hurt white persons. Lots of research has been published on that. And that's something that will go away if we can somehow emancipate ourselves from the many mythologies of Western greatness, of white male greatness and exceptionalism that we have been handed down by our historical patriarchal white supremacy on which the United States was founded. I'm now halfway through a really great book that discusses all of these important points, but really the third point in particular, and that book is by Heather McGhee, very recent book, 2021, called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. I recommend this book. There is, of course, as any good race scholar, she's a lawyer. I think she's only maybe 40 years old. As any good race scholar, there's quite a bit of history as to why things are the way they are, because unless you can, give that history of why racial disparities occur still, it's very hard to understand the current situation that we're in. She's not speaking about music, of course, but she very much speaks about how we can all prosper together if we let go, essentially, if we let go of the many mythologies of white supremacy and patriarchy, and the false belief that we should think about assimilating to whiteness and maleness, because this is, of course, a false belief. It is a mythology, because the mythology goes that whiteness represents a higher level of sophistication, of civility, of humanity, and maleness represents a higher level of sophistication and civility and humanity. That's, of course, nonsense, and we need to accept that. So I have a quick, funny vignette that I will pivot to now on my second slide, and then we can start our discussion.
Yeah, but it's just, you have to have these conversations, and it's just this weird thing. Like, white people, sometimes your response to stories of racism are just so troubling. And I'm talking about, I'm not talking about on the right, because the right has the same response. If you tell somebody on the right you had a racist thing happen, they go, there's no such thing as racism. You go, okay, I'll block you on Twitter. We're done here, I don't gotta watch Fox News. I can turn the channel, But then there's that thing that happens with white people who are your friends, who are on the left, and that thing where you go, hey, I had a thing happen, it was racism. They go, how'd you know it was racism? See every black person, oh, people of color, oh no, yeah. So do you get that response sometimes? How do you know it's racism? And it happens like this. How do you know it's racism? With like a shuffle step. How do you know it's racism? Because I'm kind of an expert in this. I've been studying it my whole life, whether I wanted to or not. I kind of know. And let me just explain, white people. This is what it sounds like when you say that to us, because I don't think you get how crazy that sounds. It would be like if I was to run into you on the street, collective white person. And I was like, hey, what do you do today? I was like, well, I got up, I ran some errands, and I had lunch. What'd you have for lunch? I had pizza. How'd you know it was pizza? You'd be like, what are you talking about? Because I knew it was pizza. It was clearly said pizza. I have pizza almost every day. That's what I think is suspicious. How are you having all this pizza every day? Because there's pizza everywhere in the world. No, I don't see all this pizza you're seeing. I don't think you had pizza. Are you sure it wasn't pita bread with cheese on it? Are you sure it wasn't pita bread with cheese on it? No, it was pizza. I've eaten a lot of pizza in my life. My parents ate a lot of pizza. My grandparents ate a lot of pizza. My great-great-great-grandparents were brought to this country to make pizza, but they weren't allowed to eat it, weirdly. I know it was goddamn pizza.
Okay. So I am now ready to have a nice, robust conversation. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this gives us a few entries already to enter into a discussion. And Ali and I put together a few questions, and I phrased mine, of course, from my position as a white male who is, over the last 2 years or so, trying to incorporate your thought into some of his modules and some of the experiences that I made in the process. So since you were just talking there, or actually, W. Campbell was just talking there about, I know what racism is. One of the things is how to convey this concept of this everyday racism to people who are not necessarily so far, haven't encountered it, and sometimes say, but I'm not actually, that's not the intention, is it? And so one of the points is it useful in your view to actually distinguish different types, different levels of this racism? For instance, if you take an example or a proposal that Akhil Mbembe made recently in his book Necropolitics, and he proposed to call this specific type nano-racism, and I quote him there. What is nano-racism, if not that narcotic brand of prejudice based on skin color that get expressed in seemingly anodyne everyday gestures, often apropos of nothing, apparently unconscious remarks, a little banter, some allusion or insinuation, a slip of the tongue, a joke, an innuendo, but also, as must be added, consciously spiteful remarks like a malicious intention, a deliberate stamping underfoot or tackle, a dark desire to stigmatize and in particular to inflict violence, to injure and humiliate, to sully those not considered to be one of us. So do you think it makes the thing, it is more nuanced and therefore helpful, or it sort of plays down this, what he calls nano-racism?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. You know, I don't know if he in his work distinguishes between nano-racism and what a lot of people call microaggressions, right? Which can carry a racial component or a sexist component or a transphobic component. And I think about microaggressions very much in the way that you just described nano-racism. And yes, those things are all true, but I actually don't think there's that much nano to it or there's that much micro to it. I would probably say that it's maybe not so useful to be thinking about micro or nano because it actually undersells the actual racism of what's happening. The way I would frame my reaction to this thought is through Martin Luther King and his letter from a Birmingham jail from 1963, in which he, and I'll paraphrase here, he said, I'm very disappointed in the white moderate. His term was white moderate. People still say moderate today, but most politicians or political pundits use the word centrist these days because moderates are quite radical in the United States, like Joe Manchin, for example. There's not that much moderation there. It's really radical. The progressives happen to be a little bit more moderate, if that makes sense to an Irish audience today. I'm sure Ali gets what I'm saying. What Martin Luther King was talking about in his disappointment of white moderates is something that I've often talked about too. So he said, in terms of dealing with white people, hey, I can handle the Ku Klux Klan. They know where I stand. I know where they stand. They just say what's on their mind. It's the truth to them. I disagree, and that's that. But it's the white moderate, the people who, like W. Kamal Bell is saying, essentially in his comedy routine, it's the ones who are your friends who are on the left, but they just quote unquote don't get it, right? So certainly the aggressive authors from volume 12 of the Journal of Schenkerian Studies are no KKK folks. I'm not saying that at all. I would say that they're so aggressive though in their anti-Blackness that they're low-hanging fruit, right? It's strange to say it. I don't know that I've ever really said this before, but I don't really have a problem with Timothy Jackson. I just disagree with him very strongly. I think he wrote some very strange things. Let's just say that. But I don't have a problem with them because they're so strange that I'm like, okay, yeah, right, whatever. And I think a lot of people had that reaction. But the main point here is that he only wrote down what a lot of people in music, academic music, actually believe, especially senior people, especially senior white folks and senior white men. He wrote down the beliefs, maybe not raising Blacks up to standard. I mean, that's a little bit over the top, but still, I mean, many of the other anti-Black things that he and other authors wrote, David Beach, Alan Cadwallader, chief among them, Boyd Pomeroy also, are in fact quite common. And there's nothing micro about those comments. There's nothing nano at all. In fact, those are the assimilationist racist beliefs on which we have built an entire field. We call it American music theory. So I would say that the center of the field, which absolutely will claim to be progressive, will claim to support people of color, will throw that Black Lives Matter t-shirt on for a day or two or wave a flag in front of their home, actually don't believe Black Lives Matter in the sense that they really honestly believe that white music is better and more worthy of our attention than non-white music. That in Russian they would say "Vot где собака зарита," and that means that's where the dog is buried. And you get what that means. That means like that's the crux of the matter. So "Vot где собака зарита." I don't know if there are any Russian speakers on the call right now, but они сами понимают меня.
Thank you. Okay, and I'm also thinking now of your first slide where you had guilt and accountability, which reminds me of when you actually visited a class in UCD via Zoom last year. And this question or something like it came up too. And you said in response to it that we shouldn't be and are not guilty for the deeds of our ancestors, yet we share responsibility for the consequences. Now, I haven't actually personally encountered, but I've read in different contexts, something like people saying, well, we shouldn't feel guilty for not being oppressed or discriminated against. So something like this book, Cynical Theories or so, where general attempts to sort of counter this kind of thinking. Would you like to elaborate a bit further maybe on this tension and how this accountability or responsibility manifests itself?
Yeah. So I don't think you're saying that. It sounded like you're saying that from the conversation at UCD we had at Zoom that the idea of guilt came up, but they were in agreement with me.
Yeah. It wasn't there. That wasn't a discussion or a controversy there, but it reminds me of that almost each time I see this thing somewhere printed, and I've seen it a few times printed in other contexts.
Yeah,
this book that I mentioned.
Yeah. Well, I think it's maybe one of the most things that I say, but I'm not alone. I just read a recent Washington Post, well, not that recent, but this summer from Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the main architects of critical race theory, which is under attack in the United States, maybe in Ireland as well, where she wrote very beautifully that this is not about whether we assign guilt to people. This is about whether we see ourselves all as responsible to one extent or another. So one elaboration, of course, I make, this shouldn't surprise anyone. I have an 11-year-old son. How much responsibility and how accountable should he hold himself? Not a whole lot, right? He's 11. I have colleagues who are 60 or 70 years old all over the world. Now, what about their responsibility, especially in the United States? Their level of responsibility is higher. And I say that irrespective of race. Now, I would also underscore that white persons in the United States who have essentially written all of the rules and the regulations and the laws and passed all the court rulings and very much created a system of, by, and for themselves as white persons, going back to 1790, the very first citizenship law, which very clearly stated in order to become a naturalized citizen of the United States of America, one must be a free white person. Why free? Because whites could still be unfree in 1790. This was 3 years after the Constitution was written by, 45 or 50 white men, most of whom owned slaves, right? So, if we think about responsibility, yes, white persons should, feel a sense of responsibility to right the wrongs of the past, so that we may all, white, black, and all other races, get to a better place with respect to racial matters in the United States of America. I would ask anybody and white colleagues directly, why would you not want to do that? Why would you not want to think of responsibility? I know that I feel responsibility because I know that in my career, I helped to create not to create the structures that I wasn't around in the 1950s and 60s when music theory was creating its structures in this country. But I certainly helped to fortify, there's no question, to fortify those structures. In the monograph that I just submitted, I say, I have been a bricklayer in the fortification of our white structures and our male structures in American music theory. And I have laid those bricks willingly and happily over the years. That's a quote from this book. You should all buy it, by the way. Got to get a shameless plug there on music theory and making music more welcoming for everyone. I have to start thinking like that. publicity, right? Free publicity. So, goodness, I'm Black, and I'm happy to take that responsibility. I shouldn't say I'm happy, but you get what I'm saying, right? I'm willing to take that responsibility and hold myself accountable, for heaven's sake. And when we hold ourselves accountable, what we're really doing is we are not denying the reality of the past. One quote from a talk that I gave that was very well attended came from a senior figure in music theory. Now, by default, this person is white because 94% of tenured faculty in music theory in the United States are in fact white. And this person was white. And they said, JSS was so ugly. And they very clearly said, this person was involved with Society for Music Theory, the National Society. And they very clearly said, JSS is not SMT. Just cleave it right off. It makes perfect sense to me. And they wrote a very nice condemnation of the journal, the Society for Music Theory, and I'm very grateful and thankful for that, without question. And it makes perfect sense to me why they would want to cleave those two things apart. But to say that Journal of Schenkerian Studies is not the Society for Music Theory is just wrong. It to a very large extent, actually, it is. The current publications chair of SMT was one of the core authors of JSS. All of the authors are members of the Society for Music Theory. I can keep making those connections, but it shouldn't be that, I shouldn't even need to, because nobody should be trying to deny in the first place that the Journal of Schenkerian Studies is music theory. It is part of what we do, and we can't deny it. That's what happened after January 6th. There was a white supremacist patriarchal insurrection at the Capitol, hadn't happened in 200 years. And it took a matter of days before the white male politicians who were being attacked themselves got in front of lecterns and started defending the people who were attacking them, and 5 people died. Talk about high levels of denialism, right? So we all need to understand that we can't deny. I mean, we can't do anything in music theory. Happily, and I'll end on this quick, happier note to get to the next question. I have noticed many people are not denying our sordid past, and many people, especially younger generations, are very, very ready to reimagine and restructure American music theory. And I am very happy. I have had a lot of conversations, and I actually think that the future is bright. So I want to end on that happy note. So maybe we can move to the next question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe that's a good one to move on to. Can you give us maybe an overview of the range of responses you've got? Because everybody knows some, and naturally the more controversial and vicious and aggressive ones catch the limelight more often. But I'm sure you got a lot of responses from all sides. So what's the balance actually between pro and con, and what's the between, let's say, constructive engagement and attacking terms of approach?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'd say it's well over 1,000 responses if I take them all kind of in totality together: social media, email, Zoom comments, YouTube comments, whatever. Excuse me, well over, it could be thousands by now. Overwhelmingly, the responses to the work that I've done, 6-7 blog posts and a long article and many YouTube, Zoom kind of appearances, has been positive. I'd say 80 to 90% has been unequivocally positive and supportive. And it shouldn't surprise anyone when I say that the younger generation is, 40 years old and younger, 95% positive, supportive, right? So it's when you get to the 60-year-old and up crowd that drops off significantly. It's hard to put a number on it. There's a much higher percentage of people who are skeptical or flat out unsupportive of the work I'm doing. I hasten to add that there are senior scholars as well who have reached out to have difficult conversations, to begin self-reflecting. And I'm honored that so many senior colleagues, and when I say senior, I'm almost by default saying white, and more often than not, cisgender men as well. But nevertheless, there have been, of course, negative comments. The pure vitriol from kind of people have tried to suck me into this kind of vortex of alt-right, white nationalism, lots of N-bombs, N-I-G-G-E-R, that type of language. And I don't really need to comment on that because, as I said in the setup, maybe before some viewers arrived, the only way to own the libs, that's a comment that alt-right people make in the United States, owning the liberals, right, is to let them own you. And if you don't engage, well, you don't. In other words, nobody's really owned me over 2 years of doing this. And that's it's been challenging. I won't say it's not a cakewalk, but I think I've been pretty successful in not being owned by bad faith, alt-right, or just flat out, kind of neo-fascist type folks. But in terms of the constructive, the constructive versus the attacking, I remember in the document you sent me with some of the ideas you wanted to discuss today, are there constructive reactions? And I have to be, like constructive but critical and saying no, pushing back. And I have to be honest. The only negative or critical reactions that have actually been constructive are the ones that have made me sharpen my arguments that Beethoven was in fact an above average composer, and that we should absolutely eliminate the German language requirement for our graduate music programs because it's a racist and sexist structure. That's why we should eliminate. We should radically rethink our piano proficiency requirements because that's racist and sexist structures. Because it is all drawing from the same Western mythology myths that somehow the world started when Socrates was born, but not a day before that, and that ancient Greece led to the Romans, which led to, ultimately all roads led to Germany, and teleologically this represented a higher level of existence, a more sophisticated, and again, a higher level of humanity. That's something I keep coming back to. That's nonsense. That's just not true. Okay, so we need to understand that that's an assimilationist outlook, which is a legacy of the United States, a legacy of what was a segregationist outlook, really all the way up until about the 1960s, when kicking and screaming, many white Americans kicking and screaming took down the whites only sign from that door and that water fountain and that restroom, and took down the blacks only sign and kicking and screaming. I mean, it wasn't this kumbaya moment where the whole country was just happy that black people were going to be able to mix among them. It was actually, I think I'm not surprising anybody when I say that that's true today. I mean, there's people who absolutely would prefer to be segregated to one extent or another, just not legally. I have to say that when I think about academic, and I'll end with this, when I think about academic music from a racial standpoint, now, of course, we can think about it from a feminist standpoint, from a disability standpoint, from a standpoint of transgender folks, from a standpoint of culture and ethnicity and geography. We can think about music from a cognitive standpoint. There are many angles, and race is one of them. Okay, fine. I've been focusing on race over the last few years. I've been focusing on Russia for decades before that, right? And I still do. But if we actually look at academic music from the racial standpoint, there is but a single intellectually honest counter-argument to the ones that I'm making. And that is the argument of white supremacist figures like Richard Spencer or David Duke. Because they just openly say, no, we're doing this because white people are smarter, better, more intellectual. And again, it goes back to the Martin Luther King comment that I was making earlier, which is, I don't have a problem. It's clear, that person's clear that they believe, generally in the 21st century, they believe that people who are not at that high level of humanity can be raised up, right, to a higher level, and that's what they should aspire to. I just disagree with that. And I don't think, I don't want to call friends and colleagues intellectually dishonest, and I'm not saying that, but I suppose by omission, I almost am. I don't want to sound rude, but again, I think that a white supremacist argument is intellectually honest. Richard Spencer is just being honest with it. I hope I never meet him. I think he's vile. Hardcore white supremacist Richard Spencer, who's younger than I am, and I'm 55. Otherwise, there is some. I often use the word obfuscation going on, because so many people who look at something like the German language exam will try to tell you that it is gender neutral and that it is race neutral because anybody can learn German. Well, that's true. I can read German, but guess what? Why is it that all the texts were actually written by white cisgender men? That's not neutral at all. That's 100% of the texts. I mean, that's just a fact, right? So happily, the neutrality arguments are going the way of the covered wagon. Most people don't make them anymore because they know they'll be laughed out of the room. These things are not race neutral. They're not gender neutral. They're not neutral with respect to LGBTQ folks or folks living with disabilities. They're not. Neutrality is a farce, and so is objectivity. And now, knowing these simple facts, we can look at what we do in the academic study of music and begin to, as I often say, reimagine what we do. And let's get to work. It's an exciting time to be doing this.
Thank you. Yeah, but that leads to the next question, which is, what's the best way for us to do this? And this is a discussion I've actually had in relation to many other, not just race, but other subjects as well with colleagues. There's this old 19th century ideal of disinterestedness and objectivity and being neutral. And Max Weber said in 1919 in Science as Vocation, you should be teachers, you should never be politicians, you should never go out there and sort of pontificate. You just do you provide the argument and others might do that. And of course, nowadays, that seems to have reversed quite a bit. It goes more like Karl Marx's Feuerbach thesis number 11. So philosophers and by extension academics have long enough interpreted the world. Now the time is go out and change it. So do you think we should, because I feel what you do is actually you do provide arguments, you argue your case. It's not that emotional, even though its emotion is behind it. But should we go out and try much the Richard Spencer's, who by the way holds a music degree, and not directly eye to eye maybe, but do something similar for our cause? Or do you think it is actually better and it looks more objective and still that has value, having that approach, and let others do that, less the public intellectual and more the writer, let's say?
That's a great question. The journalist Ramona Martinez says that objectivity is the ideology of the status quo. You mentioned Max Weber and how he said you shouldn't be indoctrinating students. Well, Max Weber, according to Joe Fagan, the sociologist at Texas A&M, was a biological racist. I would have been stunned if he weren't. Max Weber died in 1920, so the quote you referenced came right as he was on his deathbed. But let's just drill down into that a little bit. If Max Weber is saying let's not indoctrinate students, but he himself is a biological racist, how do you suppose he presented his arguments in class? Objectively, right? I mean, obviously he objective. That's a given. But how objective could a person who literally believed in the biological inferiority of non-white races be objective? In other words, that's the objectivity of what Max Weber was saying is absolute. And I'm not saying, Wolfgang, that you're actually saying that there is such a thing. I think you understand that there's not. But I would say that in terms of what we can do in presenting these ideas is emphasize to our friends and colleagues that insofar as in the academic study of music, 100% of the missions of the schools and departments of music, the examinations, the comprehensive qualifying examinations for doctoral students, the guidelines for writing dissertations, the language requirements, the requirements for admission into these programs, the core music curricula for undergraduates. These were conceived many, many decades ago, almost always, if not more than a century ago. In other words, the foundation was laid even in the 19th century. Now, it's not crazy to say that those 19th century foundations reflected the white supremacist patriarchy that the United States was in the 19th century. So the New York Philharmonic may have started in 1842, but it didn't allow its first Black person to play a violin. It was Sanford Allen in 1962. It took 120 years. And of course, in a white racial frame, the natural response to that, it would be, oh, well, there were no Black players who could have played in a symphony like that. When people say that, they are either ignorant to the facts or they're actually lying. And you can see both of those things in the white racial frame. It's total nonsense, always. There were no women who composed operas in the late 19th century. That's why we haven't performed an opera by a woman composer. That's never been true. So when somebody says something like that, it's very important to just say, well, you need to know, though. You need to know your facts, right? I know that John Thomas Douglas was a virtuoso violinist who wrote a 3-act opera, Virginia's Ball, which was premiered. I could walk to where it was, the Stuyvesant Institute. It would take me about an hour, hour and a half. In 1868, that was premiered. He was a virtuoso violinist who studied in Dresden, composition with Edward Rapoldi, and then he studied in Paris. He was born in 1847 of a slave mother in the United States. He taught David Manis of the Manis School of Music here in New York, where my son is actually a part of the junior prep program. John Thomas Douglas taught David Manis in German, by the way, in the German language, because the family didn't speak very good English in the 1870s. And David Manis, in his autobiography, flat out says, John would have loved to play in a professional orchestra, but they did not allow colored people to play in their orchestras at that point. So one must arm. So to answer the question, Wolfgang, what can we do? Well, first we have to just call spades spades. We can't use coded language. We can't say music theory lacks diversity. We have to say music theory is white. We have to be able to say, as a white person, white people need to be able to say white themselves. I see 67 participants. I would just ask everybody to take a big breath, and on the word after 3, say the word white. 1, 2, 3. White. See, nobody died. I hope there's never, I still see 67 there, right? And the sun didn't come down, or the moon didn't go down. We're all going to be fine. White people have used the word Black and all kinds of classifications to classify all non-white races for centuries. Furthermore, white people in the United States from 1691, when the word white first appeared in legislation, it was the Virginia House of Burgesses, so English colony, right? And it was to stop English or white women, and it was connected to gender, from marrying Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians. That's what the legislation said. First use of the word white well, it wasn't, I was going to say the United States, it wasn't, it was an English colony, 1691. All the way up through Loving v. Virginia, 1967, with that struck down anti-miscegenation laws. So white and Black people could marry, but all other races could marry. Alan Bakke, I'm sure the word white appeared in that. That was 1980. Alan Bakke v. UC Regents, a white military veteran sued the University of California because he was denied admittance. In other words, white people use the word white a lot in legislation, until it became difficult in the late 20th century. And then it became taboo, and all of a sudden we can't say white anymore, but that doesn't make any sense. We can't do any work if we can't say that. So you have to kind of come from this very clear-eyed, simple position. You have to bone up on race scholarship and feminist scholarship, because those two things are just tied right at the hip, right? And then you need to push back when you hear the coded language, when you hear, oh, you know what we did with our, Phil made a good point with the language exam. So instead of requiring the German language, we're just going to require a foreign language. No. You don't get credit for anti-racist action there. That's just racist action in disguise. It's still going to be the German language exam. It just is, because the structures are all there. So there's all kinds of trickery going on to try to keep the status quo. It's human nature. People who have power want to keep the power. I get that on its face, right? But I would hope that all white friends and colleagues could see how negatively they themselves are being impacted. It's a lot easier for people who are not white to see the negative impact. And I hope that we could all convince white friends and colleagues how impoverished our entire field is by trying to keep that Beethoven up on that hallowed hilltop, rather than just treating him like another composer who wrote very interesting music, because he did. Keeping that Shakespeare up there as the greatest writer who ever lived, way up on that hilltop. That's a great burden to bear, is it not? Folks, Shakespeare died in 1616, just saying. Okay, it's time we acknowledge that, yeah, he was a good writer. And so were another thousands of writers out there that we have not yet explored. And put on some of their plays, for example, draw inspiration from someone else. Maybe someone whose skin was white, but maybe someone whose skin was not, you know? And open up these things to other folks, not just adding pieces by Florence Price. That's DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And that's fine, that's good. But having the discussions, the difficult, hard discussions, and proving and showing how and why we never knew the name Florence Price until Alex Ross wrote about it about 3 years ago in the New Yorker. And God bless him for that, right? But there is a nasty story if you're willing to write that thesis or that dissertation about why Florence Price was shunted to the side. That's the anti-racist work, and that's the anti-sexist work. That's where the real hard truths lie, and that's where energy should be focused, in my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I see the first questions are arriving, one, but please also feel free to add more. I ask one more question and then we open it up to the floor, and maybe we have a few more questions then ready. There are people out there on the left, you might say traditional modernists mainly, who sometimes, I recently reviewed something in that direction, argue that the focus on gender and race and essentially identity politics has been, to put it slightly unfairly, generally a bit of a diversion. We should really focus again and fully on class as the main problem in society. And we have lost track of that a bit. And that would actually help us much more, or maybe at least equally. I personally disagree with that, but I do see that there are sort of parties who say one side still does mainly that and nothing else. And the people who work on, or some people who work on race and gender don't bring in that much class. And is this, obviously it shouldn't be an either or, but what's your view? Should there be a way of bringing this together, or is this a risk of, again, diluting things if you try to fight everything at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
On all fronts?
Yeah, that's a great question too, Wolfgang. So class is without a doubt very important, and it should be part of the conversation without question. You know what's more important than class? Race. I would cite here Dorothy Brown, a Black accountant who wrote a wonderful book, also recent. It's called The Whiteness of Wealth. Dorothy Brown. If you want to get a nice layout of it, there's a great Chris Hayes. He's an MSNBC talking head, a very smart guy. He's got a podcast called Why Is This Happening? And he interviewed Dorothy Brown. So you could start with that. You know, if you're commuting, it's a nice 45 minute pod with Christopher Hayes. Why Is This Happening? Interviews Dorothy Brown and her book, The Whiteness of Wealth. So, you know, she talked in that book about how directly to this question, because all of the accountants that she was talking to would say, Dorothy, it's not about race, it's class. It's not about race, it's class. It's not about race, it's class. But guess what? All of the accountants you were talking to were white cisgender men. Talking about class is a great way to take the focus off of whiteness. And in the academic study of music in the United States of America, I am now an expert at pointing out when people want to take the focus off of whiteness. So your instinct is right, Wolfgang, to disagree with that notion that class is more important. And now I can invoke Heather McGhee, the author I began with today, because she writes at length in her book about how white frameworks try to make a zero-sum game out of everything. So in trying to say we should be focusing on class and not race, they have a fulcrum. It's a seesaw. So you're focusing on race, but we should be focusing on class. It should be like this. You see, it has to be one or the other. But it's never like that. It's like me and my Beethoven post. Beethoven's above average composer. Let's leave it at that. Oh, either Beethoven was the best composer in the world or he was trash. And that's all we have. So either Phil is right about this and he's not. This is the conservative voices. And we need to do this, right? It's no, Beethoven was a fine composer. People have written me, you know, aggressive responses. I hear you hate Beethoven, somebody wrote me 2 weeks ago. I'm like, that's funny. Of course, I never said that because I don't hate Beethoven. I kind of like his music. He wrote 5 cello sonatas, for crying out loud. For the listeners who don't know, I'm a cellist. But yes, of course, class is important, but it is a diversion tactic. It's been a very useful diversion tactic. People, race scholars who do write about race, it happens a lot. Of course, 50, 100 years ago, communism was a very common intersecting aspect of the class element in race studies. But in communism and communism studies, they cannot conceive of race outside of class. And that's a problem, actually, because race very much can exist irrespective of class. Race very much does exist irrespective of class. So to answer the question, of course we should take class into account, and we should take race into account even more, and other identities like being transgender, for example, living with disabilities. There are other things that intersect. The one thing that I keep coming back to, and that most race scholars will keep coming back to, is the whiteness and the maleness that historically has governed the United States of America. And of course, it's been active in other places where whiteness and maleness reign supreme. I should add cisnormativity, of course. That's a topic that's only really come up over the last, say, 10 years or so. But it goes without saying that the white men who were in power over all these centuries were generally cisnormative, of course, despite the fact that transgender and non-binary folks have always been among us, always. And the fact that, as I'm sure the listener knows, the gender binary is as fallacious and mistaken as the concept of race itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, shall we move on then to the first question from the audience?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we have here, I read it out. Hi, Professor, I'm a student of music theory in America with a degree in jazz performance. What do you say to young emerging scholars who feel caught in their conscious, not necessarily imposed, between responsibility to greater diversity and inclusion and a recognition that certain styles have clear competencies? This includes jazz. Do you feel any tension regarding these definitions of responsibility?
I'm also looking at this question here. I can cue it up here. Yeah. I do not feel any tensions regarding these definitions of responsibility. Of course, there are competencies that require a high level of skill, right? Like jazz. I don't know what the questioner's instrument is, but there should always be an open path for people who are skilled at performing an instrument. And if it happens to be in the genre of jazz, well, that's great. I would like to briefly talk about the exclusion of jazz, because the person is bringing it up, and how it kind of interacts with music and music theory. This is something from a talk that I've given. I'm not going to dial it up because I'll try to make it just 1 or 2 minutes, but I think it's important because jazz and all other non-white musics have been segregated out. One of the main things I'm talking about recently is, let's not decolonize the music curriculum. Let's desegregate it, because in the United States, races were segregated. And it is every bit as applicable to our music curriculum. This is not to say that decolonization studies are not important. They absolutely are. I just wish to highlight the reasons why a music like jazz has been segregated. And in a couple of minutes, I make in my monograph and in a talk I'm giving recently, I talk about the 1619 Project and Janine Interlandi's work about healthcare. This is an analogy to show how our music curricula are segregated, and why jazz is not, because jazz is historically probably our most important musical export and our most historic American music for that matter. And yet it is very much on the fringe. It's represented in our institutions, but it's on the fringe. It's not, certainly not part of a core of music theory. So Janine Interlandi for 1619 talks about how Harry Truman pushed for a national healthcare system, but the American Medical Association torpedoed it. Why? They didn't want to racially integrate the hospitals. The AMA was an all-white male doctors organization, and they lobbied against it. Truman was, it was socialized medicine, and it was going to destroy the patient-doctor relationship, and Truman was a communist. Well, Truman was a member of the KKK in the 1920s, I'll tell you that, but he wasn't a communist. And so the AMA torpedoed it, and they were able to keep the hospitals segregated. Whites only floor. The second floor is whites only. The third is whites only. The basement is where the Black floors were. Black people can go to the basement, right? In the 1960s, it was a little different because lots of civil rights stuff was happening, and Medicare essentially integrated the hospitals because the United States, Lyndon Johnson, there was a very famous doctor, his name was Montague Cobb. Of course, the AMA still tried to torpedo it, but they were not able to because civil rights was very much on everyone's mind in the 1960s. And Janine Interlandi writes, as soon as Medicare passed and there were these millions and millions and millions of federal dollars involved, the hospitals desegregated. In 4 months in 1965, 3,000 hospitals desegregated because of money. And the analogy is this: the reason our music curricula never desegregated is because we never had the US federal government saying, hey, if you desegregate your music curriculum, you get $5 million. But if you don't do that, you can't have it. So we never had any incentive at all to desegregate our music curriculum. And that's why to this day, we actually have textbooks that have about 99% white composers represented. And they call it music theory, as if the only people who wrote compositions worthy of music theory were white persons. Now, it's changing pretty rapidly now, as it should, but I try to think about the history and why things are the way they are. Jazz was never accepted because of its roots in African Americanism. And that is why it was segregated out. I don't know that I specifically answered that question. I apologize for the diversion, but I think it was still, pretty relevant. So thank you for that.
So thank you. Yeah, feel free to ask more questions. We have a bit of time left. I have more too, so we can fill this. But while you type, maybe one more question. Now, since all of this started, in your own teaching and your own research, have there been changes? So if you say, I don't know if you have time for that anymore, but say you write an essay on some Russian piece or some Russian composer, how is your own approach to the analytical part now possibly different, or is it not? And also, when you actually teach music theory in class, has there been has it evolved in some way? I know, of course, you can only teach your one class and it's not the curriculum, but still, have there been developments now over the last 2-3 years?
Yes, absolutely. So to the academic part first, and I would encourage everybody to think about this. So I'm a Russianist, and I write about Russian music theory and Russian music, Russian opera. And no, I've been very busy with lots of other projects over the last year or so. So I haven't started any new projects as a Russianist, unfortunately. But I will again, and the next time I do, I'm going to actively seek out interesting new perspectives from people whose names were not Boleslav Yavorsky or Lev Mazel or the other music theorists on whom through whose work I viewed certain Rimsky-Korsakov pieces by Rimsky-Korsakov or Prokofiev or things like that. And I'll bring in other voices, and I'm interested to see what I find, because once you have to start, you have to be kind of creative when you're trying to look outside of the canon, because the canon, the quote unquote Western canon, I always have to put quotes around that now. I have a long chapter in my book about how the West was just a creation of white supremacy in the late 19th century. The West didn't exist. The concept of the West did not exist before about 1850. I don't know if the listener knows that. Other fields like classics and history, they've done a lot of work in that. In music, we really have done very little. But I know that people who are doing work in canonic classical composers, I talked to a senior colleague who was working with Bach, for example, and this person just said, well, I obviously can't be engaging with BIPOC figures because I'm working on Bach. And, I don't like to be disrespectful. This was just a one-on-one conversation, but I did essentially say, are you sure about that? Because I'm pretty sure that if you just kind of expanded your thinking a little bit, you could find interesting new things. And then you can, of course, bring in lots of different sources the way I have I've mentioned W. Kamau Bell. I mean, that's great work because you get to laugh when you're doing that academic work, right? Or Heather McGhee, there's not much laughing in there because she's laying out some difficult stories. But how about talking about Heather McGhee? She's going to tell you something that happened in maybe 1840, but say 1940 or 50. And then you can link it to an article written about Bach in 1940 or 50. You can link it pretty easily, actually. And you're going to find, in other words, you can make part of the research racial. You can racialize part of the research and do some anti-racist research and action and still end up with an article about Bach. It's going to only be a better, more interesting article. Caveat: music theory is still not ready to publish research like that. It still it's digging in its heels. It's kind of spinning actually right now. I'm watching my own field kind of figure things out. They can't handle some of the changes that are happening, and they will likely reject articles of research that are written with a racial aspect or a feminist aspect or a sexuality aspect. But good work will find its home. You can only control your own excellence. With respect to teaching, absolutely same type of thing. I'm actually not in the class. I'm doing a million administrative things right now. I'm not in the classroom this term. Next term, I'm doing a 20th century class, and I'm so looking forward to it because it's, the sky's the limit. I don't have to only talk about Schoenberg, Webern and Berg, and Stravinsky and Bartók, and then end up with Milton Babbitt. There were some really not nice figures in this pantheon of whiteness and maleness in the 20th century. Some were actually not too bad figures. Others were not nice people, let's just say. I'm thinking about Milton Babbitt and Igor Stravinsky, for example, among others. And now I will actually just bring out this is what Milton Babbitt said about Black people. This is what Stravinsky said about Jewish people. I make that part of my teaching now. Whiteness and maleness has always taught us not to. And that's, of course, to preserve and fortify the whiteness and the maleness. It's just about exceptionalism. Don't talk about Wagner's horribleness, right? I get it now. And I absolutely encourage everybody to talk about Wagner's horribleness. If you don't, you shouldn't be talking about Wagner in your class, in my opinion. And in terms of 20th century, oh my goodness, think about all of the African-American figures in jazz. Muhal Richard Abrams, Jerry Allen, Ollie Wilson, classical composers like, let me see, I have these beautiful women composers here, Margaret Bonds, and they're not all American necessarily. Julia Perry certainly is. Alice Coltrane is up here. And I get to add them to my 20th century music class. Think about what a great class that's going to be. Oh yeah, and we'll listen to a little bit of Stravinsky too, with all the caveats I just mentioned. Why not? He was a good composer. Anything else?
Yeah.
Yeah, I will pose. We have a couple of questions in the chat. This one is, what do you think about some authors' practice of leaving apart the traditional music theory in their aim to approximate a new kind of music theory? For instance, when someone tries to give a thorough definition of polyphony, but explicitly eliminates what was being done during the Renaissance and Baroque in Central Europe, because this kind of thinking has been dominant. Do you think this is censure? And do you think you're being honest with students and your audience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I presume when the person is saying what was being done during the Renaissance and the Baroque, you might be talking about colonization or things outside of music, perhaps. I don't think it's censure necessarily, but we in music theory and in the academic study of music in this country to a very, very large extent have been given this very, very, how can I say it? Well, incomplete for sure, but well, fanciful, let's say, a very fanciful idea of what the academic study of music actually is. So it's not so much about censure as it is about exclusion and omission. Of course, there is interesting polyphony written and interesting counterpoint and madrigals and motets, you know, going back to the Middle Ages and then through the different periods that we are taught comprise the periods that constitute our Western canon of music. And they can of course be studied. There's no reason that they should just be banned outright. That wouldn't make any sense at all. But my recommendation or my thought here is that if you're going to be presenting polyphony from the 16th century, you know, say you're going to do some Palestrina or maybe, I don't know, Josquin or something. Wouldn't it be interesting to be presenting music from the 16th century from India at the same time? Or from, you know, sub-Saharan Africa somewhere, or pre-colonial Americas, I don't know, you know, and just be talking about these worldwide trends in music. In other words, contextualizing these composers rather than allowing the legacy of white supremacy and patriarchy to kind of lay dormant in the music curriculum. As do we talk about the rapacious you know, violence that the Portuguese were and the Spaniards and the, you know, the English were bringing to the world as we you know, at the same time as we discuss Palestrina? I don't know that that's the right question. I think you know, rather it's about trends, larger trends on the planet, and there absolutely can be a place in that class if it's say a music history class where you do talk about some of the more difficult aspects, where you talk about some of the white supremacist, you know, the colonial excursions across the globe, because that certainly shaped how all of this has been taught. But there's some serious reimagining that needs to happen. Many places are doing that now, but it's kind of difficult. I see a lot, again, deer in headlights. That's kind of what I began with. I see a lot of deer in headlights in that they are, you know, a lot of people are saying, well, what do we do? I still want to teach all the same stuff I'm teaching, but I'm getting a lot of pressure because absolutely everybody on my syllabus is a white man. I get it. It's not easy to you know, reframe a syllabus that literally has existed for 20 years that was all white men and everybody was okay with that. It's not okay any longer. It should never have been okay to begin with. I'll end with that. Another question?
Yeah. Yeah, there's one more question. Musicologists Barbara Garvey Jackson and especially the late Ray Linda Brown have been writing extensively about Florence Price since the late 1970s. Please could we acknowledge the intellectual contributions of these women and credit them rather than Alex Ross with the recovery of Florence Price?
Great point. Totally agree. Thank you for that.
Okay, is that another one? Because I don't see, no, that's fine. Yeah, that's it for now. Okay, maybe can I ask you one more question about the content of the article, because that's the one thing I am thinking about every now and then with regard to the idea of hierarchies and the way in which Schenker, you argue, brought the idea of structure and hierarchical thinking from his thinking about racial contexts to music theory. Because that is something I'm struggling with it, in the sense that, for instance, my own work about, I'm just preparing a paper about genre, the concept of genre today. And I find it difficult to get at something structurally without thinking of hierarchy in a horizontal or vertical way. In some way, it seems to me almost inevitable to do that. So While in his case, it may have been that way, but does it always have to be that way? Or how do I possibly get around the problem of bringing this back to the creator? Because that brings us to another point. I was raised, academically speaking, with Roland Barthes and the idea of the death of the author. So meaning always comes from what we put into it or hear out of it, not from what the creator intentionally or non-intentionally put into it. We can research that for biographies, but ultimately it's not that, it shouldn't be that relevant. But in a way, your argument says, it goes back and says, no, it is relevant. This is a bit like another great man, or maybe flawed man, but certainly influential man theory. Can also be a woman, of course, but certainly the creator is much bigger again than he or she used to be.
Yeah, that's also a great question, Wolfgang. You know, Carl Schachter said in an article from 2001, I'm getting some sunlight here in Manhattan. Maybe I'll try to just, okay, there we go. In 2001, Carl Schachter commented on the hierarchical, he actually was the first English language author to use the word racism in relation to Heinrich Schenker. But he also commented on the hierarchies that you're commenting on and said something to the effect that, well, Schenker was hardly the first music theorist to talk about hierarchies in music. So that's absolutely right. I think your question though is getting to, is it possible to, well, if you could clarify a little bit, Wolfgang,
can we think about tonal music without somehow resorting to some kind of hierarchical relationship between tones or chords?
Yeah, I think we absolutely can, but I personally wouldn't say that that's a better way to think about the music. In other words, I think it's perfectly fine to think about hierarchies. And one could think about them in tonal music, for example, and one could think about them in other aspects of our academic study of music. But it's one thing to suggest that there are tonal layers and hierarchical structures in a piece of music. It's something quite different to write very prolifically about the hierarchies of race and how everything is one worldview, as Heinrich Schenker did. I mean, he clearly believed that one is just a mirror of the other, right? In his totally unified world of worldview. If somebody's looking and thinking about hierarchies in any artistic form, that doesn't necessarily have to be tied to racial hierarchies or gender hierarchies or hierarchies of other identities. I would caution anyone though to think that by simply not speaking about race or gender or other things like that, that the piece, that the work in question is therefore void of racial considerations. That's not really possible. It's just not. I'm not saying that if you're talking about music hierarchically, you're thinking about race hierarchically. No, I'm not saying that. But to say that there's no racial aspect of it, well, I mean, in the theoretical realm, there's the piece of art, and there's just, we can talk about the philosophy about it, we can talk about Roland Barthes, but there's always going to be this type of I don't know, earthly, worldly consideration about how the artwork is perceived, how it's personified, how it is presented. And that is when things will get, they'll go sideways very quickly. That is when people of color and non-binary folks and people who, the farther one gets away from the golden standard of whiteness and maleness and cisnormativity, let's be clear, of our patriarchal white supremacy as it's been handed down to us, the harder it becomes to even engage in discussions about Roland Barthes or hierarchical structures, right? I mean, we can't even allow, we can't see that the farther one gets away from that magnet that's trying to pull us up to this quote unquote higher level of humanity in a very mythological way. I mean, it's a pyramid scheme. The Nigerian American author, Ijeoma Oluo, calls white supremacy a pyramid scheme. And that's a great way of putting it, because there's this hierarchy that there are very few people up top. I mean, Heinrich Schenker had 12 composers he considered to be true geniuses, one of whom was Domenico Scarlatti, and of course Tchaikovsky or Stravinsky, they were not, for example. So I guess maybe what I'm saying, Wolfgang, is, your question sounded a little bit more on the theoretical or the abstract side, let's say. And right now I'm very much living in the non-abstract world. I have lived in that abstract world before. I'm a music theorist, right? I mean, if you look at some of my articles from 5-10 years ago, you'll see that they can be very abstract as well, because that's the way I was taught. But it's really hard for me to kind of break out of where I am right now. So I guess I'm kind of giving a qualified answer to you. Maybe it's kind of like I'm not sure answer, and I hope that we can leave it at that.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the Q&A. Sure. Thank you for this webinar, very interesting. You have talked about race, gender, class as different problematic borders in music theory curriculum. What do you think about the species border? What do you think in this impulse of inclusion about listening, studying, analyzing, and even teaching the non-human, beyond human, more than human sounds?
Interesting. A friend of mine, Richard Bodwin at Dartmouth, is currently working on a manuscript about the extra sounds that are not, of course, this is saying like more than human sounds. I'm thinking, no, actually Alexandra Reading wrote a book. I can't really reference that because I don't know quite about it, because there were some quote unquote it's like alien listening or something. He's got a book coming out, Alexandra Reading, Harvard University. Yeah, that's a great, interesting question. Haven't really thought about it that much. I mean, of course, there are lots of sounds out there, non-human sounds. I can't speak with any authority on that, though. I think I should just say, thank you for the question. It's interesting. I should think about it some more.
Okay, any other questions? Please type it in now. Otherwise, I think we may come gradually to the conclusion, to what I think has been a very interesting seminar that has shared very interesting views and particularly explained a lot of things. And I think it's always important to be able to engage with the views in more detail, in a more nuanced way, because there are lots of people out there, as you said, who say, well, I found particularly this seesaw thing very instructive, where you say it has to be either this or that. It cannot be in the middle. And that is something that I think if we deal with post-truth in general terms, we have to tackle. But I see there is one question where maybe we make that the final question here. As you know, the first programs in Black Studies and Women's Studies began in the 1970s. Eileen Southern, most famously, was the chair of the first Black Studies program at Harvard. Many women, now in their late 70s and well beyond, were founding faculty members of these programs and created the first courses on women in music, and on music and gender, race, class, sexuality, etc. Many of them were teaching about sexism and racism in music 30, 40, 50 years ago, in some cases at considerable cost to their careers. We need to restore the historical memory of this phenomenon. These mostly women have much to add to this conversation that could prevent much reinvention of the wheel that is currently happening. In light of this, I wonder if would you like to reconsider the helpfulness of what some could perceive as ageism in this discussion, vis-a-vis your comments regarding senior people and the 60+ crowd, as you described them.
Did you leave that up there and not?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can just look at it for a sec. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Very good question. And yes, somebody might think about ageism, but with respect to my 60+ crowd comment, but facts are facts. I mean, Wolfgang asked me about people who've responded, and I've gotten over 1,000 responses, and I'm just stating facts that by far and away, the people who are skeptical of the things I've said and written about, without question, are senior colleagues and musicians. Sometimes they're not colleagues, they're just people who've reached out. If this questioner wants to call that ageism, then you can call it ageism, but it's a statistic, actually. It's just true. And I also hasten to add, and I'm going to repeat myself because this is something I said maybe 30, 40 minutes ago. I've been truly honored that I've heard from so many senior colleagues who have contacted me, and we've had conversations on the phone and on Zoom And we have, been working on projects together. And I'm doing that right now, actually, with two different groups of people. And there are several senior colleagues, and they have been kind of at the forefront of some of these issues. With respect to the women and Black women especially, that's a great point. And actually, I think you'll find if you look at my Realm blog that I put out a few months ago, you'll see many of the names, including Eileen Southern, in my work there. I'm currently working on a project, and there are 3 senior Black women on the project. I don't want to name the names because I don't know that the project's going to get off the ground, and we're not quite ready to announce. If this questioner, I feel it might be the same person from before, and even if it's not, that's perfectly fine. We need to restore the historical memory of this phenomenon. I think that that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Actually, I'm trying to restore the historical memory. And if I didn't mention a few names in a talk that's an hour and 15 minutes long, what can I say? It's not that I haven't mentioned Eileen Southern and Rosita Sands and Emmett Price and Samuel Floyd. I can mention those names because these are eminent Black scholars, Lucius Wyatt, Horace Boyer, Calvin Grimes. I do know the names and I know the history. If this person is suggesting that I don't, then I would respectfully push back against that, because African-American music is something I work with aside from being a Russianist, and I have always worked with, and I happen to know many of the people that this person is talking about. So thank you for the question, though, and for the comment. It's very good, and you've noticed something that is maybe I haven't said today. I would just respectfully say that just because I didn't say it today doesn't mean that I don't write about it and think about it. And start with my blog post for Realm, and you'll see a different side of some of these comments. And I'd love to hear comment from this person if they are interested in following up with me in an email to my Hunter P. Ewell at hunter.cuny.edu. Thank you.
Phil, I just have, can you hear me? Yeah, I just have a quick follow-up to that question.
Please.
And with this 60 plus crowd, it is one of the things that I've been thinking about in the last 10 years, and you probably have too, is one of the reasons this 60 plus crowd, it's twofold, might be emailing you because they have the most job security with tenure, with full professorships, et cetera. But of course, the flip side of that job security was afforded to them because of the different opportunities and the different canons we had then. And so by saying the 60 plus crowd, I mean, you and I are both middle-aged. Maybe it's our generation that's going to flip that. But the kind of catch-22 is there. I'm sure there are people in their 20s and 30s who might share the same views as this 60 plus crowd, but just don't have the security to argue or send you a nasty gram, so to speak.
You're right, Allie. That's I have thought about that. I do try to highlight as much as I can. When I say, I hasten to add that there are senior colleagues, and certainly white men among them, who reached out. I do want to try to emphasize in my 3 points I started with. I want to reach out. I want to let white people know I want them at my table with the caveats I put out there. And yes, on the flip side, that's a very important flip side. There are, without question, the junior crowd too, who do not have the standing. Maybe there are some of the anonymous things I've seen that could be. And yeah, there are definitely junior folks who want to keep Beethoven up on that hill, and Shakespeare as well, because white supremacy and patriarchy is not something that was just dreamt up in the last few years. It's Ibram Kendi says about 550 years old. He puts it, there were some papal decrees in the 15th century that were very key to beginning some of the colonial conquests that Portugal set out on, and then Spain in 1450, 1460. So if you're dealing with 500 years plus years of structures and institutions, it's not something that you can just shed in a few years. But I think in the academic study of music over here in the States, I want to try to end on a high note and say, hey, I've had so many Zooms and so many conversations with so many people, really from all over the world, but I'll just talk about the States, where people are really making big, bold changes, and they're trying to think about big things, and it's working to a degree. Is it going to be easy? No, it's going to be a struggle. Social justice always is. As the one questioner was talking about the folks from behind, I mean, there's a reason why people know about Florence Price. With respect to the questioner, the Black authors doing work on Florence Price before, and God bless them for doing it, and it was great work. The reason it was never heard is because they were Black, right? I mean, that's the reason. The reason why we know Florence Price is because Alex Ross is white. You can't, spin that any other way. I don't want to unduly give Alex Ross the credit for discovering Florence Price. Of course, there was a lot of her music was only found in Chicago, like, what was it, 5 or 10 years ago, right? So there's that practical element of the scores were not around for a while. And then he wrote about it, and then there was this resurgence. That's true. But I think that the bold moves that I see these days are actually indicative of some big changes. It takes time to think about new curricula. I'm working on a co-authored textbook for undergraduate music theory, and that's going to hopefully be out in 2023. So you have to, start somewhere. But once new materials come out, and then you can start conceiving of, Robert Schumann on a page next to Thelonious Monk, which should have always been like that, right? And with respect to the impact on music in the United States, well, Thelonious Monk had a far larger impact than Robert Schumann. I imagine there's some people who would say, no, that's not true because it's Robert Schumann, and then race enters into the picture. But I would never say one was a better or worse composer or genius. I don't use words like that. That's just silly talk. But I have no problem saying that Thelonious Monk was, without question, a more influential figure on American music than Robert Schumann. But that's not what we're taught, right? We're still taught this craziness because of the whiteness and the maleness. We still sometimes teach people that, not directly, because we don't directly put up Thelonious Monk and Robert Schumann. I'm just hypothetically doing that. But we still essentially are saying that what Robert Schumann represents is better than what Thelonious Monk represents. That really is still part of what we do, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. I know a lot of people would say, no, it's not like that, blah, blah, blah. But I've been doing this for some years now, and I would just respectfully say that's my opinion. And if somebody disagrees, well, a lot of people are going to disagree, but I'll keep forging ahead, as we all should.
Well, let's end on that positive note. Phil, thank you so much for joining us and having this stimulating dialogue. I'd like to plug next week a little bit along the same lines. Bob Fink is giving a paper, The Empirical Strikes Back, Pop Music, Data Science, and the White Racial Frame at the same time. So thanks again. Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you, all these attendees, and looking forward to see many of you next week as well.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun. Take care, guys.
Thank you.